Hello dear learner, I welcome you to the lecture 1 of week 9, and the topic of today's lecture is the ecological critique, and we will study under this the topic which is titled the ecological democracy. So, ecological democracy is the topic of today's lecture. Now, first of all, we will discuss about the concepts to be covered in today's lecture. First of all, we will understand what we mean by the term which is ecological democracy. Then what is the relationship between democracy and ecological protection? Then what is the specialist versus the non-specialist debate? Then what are the ecological goals of North and South, and is there any difference between them? Then what is the role of movements? Here I mean the movements which have been engaged for the protection of the environment, and the role of the participatory democracy. And finally, we will understand what are the elements of ecological democracy. So, first of all, we will understand the meaning of the ecological democracy. Ecological democracy assumes that there are key empirical intersections between democracy and environment. So, till now in the conventional understanding of democracy, we have not given suitable importance to the role or the importance of environment, whether in terms of policy making, whether in terms of development. In fact, we did not recognize that there can be any substantial and relationship between the democracy and the environment. Now, this relationship is what the proponents of the ecological democracy talks about. They say that there are very important empirical intersections, which means interrelationship, interrelation or interlinkages between democracy and environment, and therefore it pays closer attention to relationship between democracy and environment. And especially when we are facing the problem of tremendous environmental degradation, when we are facing the problems of climate change, global warming and so many other issues, then it has become very pertinent and it has become a very relevant question to ask that why our democracy has failed in addressing the problems of the environmental degradation. So, with this background, I would like to add that the term ecological democracy has not received adequate attention by the scholars and policy makers, which I have already mentioned just now. And one of the important reason, along with the others which I have mentioned, is the vagueness of its meaning, because ecological democracy is not a word which is used in common parlance. The common people, they do not use it, and sometimes they are not even aware of these words. So, it has been limited to only specialists or those who are undertaking a study in these areas, they are aware of this term. So, ecological democracy, which concerns the involvement of each and every citizens in the process of environmental decision making, or whether it is a question of protecting the environment, there the lack of awareness as well as the vagueness of the term is a very important barrier. And the next very important thing is lack of political will, because ultimately it is the political leaders, the administrators, the bureaucrats, they have to address these issues, and unfortunately environment has never been the prime focus of any of the manifestos of the political parties. So, this is another very unfortunate thing which we witness. Now, ecological democracy is a model of democracy that talks about involving citizens in the process of environmental decision making. Now, environmental decision making means that anything which concerns or which affects the environment. In fact, we all are living in an environment. So, any decisions which we take has certain impact on the environment. So, I do not think that there is any issue which we can say can have no impact on environment. So, environmental aspect is always and should be part and parcel of our every decision making. But unfortunately, we have witnessed that in all the decision making, environmental aspect has remained very neglected, and most of the time we have viewed environment as a source of getting more and more natural resources, or using it as a commodity to earn more profits or to increase production. But we have to look it from the perspective of its preservation, how it can be renewed, how it can be protected, but unfortunately it has not taken place. And second important thing is that there has been a very negligible involvement of common people, especially in the process of decision making, which affects ultimately their lives and their environment. And we find this especially in the context of people who are staying in the rural areas or the tribal people whose lives are dependent on environment. Now, the ecological democracy prevents ecological degradation by some groups and imposing the consequences of the degradation on others. Now, this has been a rampant practice underlying the modern form of economic development, whether it is the Western countries who have exploited the non-Western countries or countries of the South, and they are today enjoying the fruits of development by exploiting the natural resources and the cheap labor of the South, or whether you see within a country, even in a southern country, you will find there is a division between an elite and a non-elite, the poor and the rich, where the rich are enjoying all access to natural resources, they are enjoying all the privileges of life, with the poor and the downtrodden, those who are marginalized, they are left to really struggle for their everyday existence. So, such is the difference or a type of discrimination which is existing not only between the developed countries and the underdeveloped countries, but even within an underdeveloped countries we find such type of inequalities. So, actually ecological democracy raises voice or it protests and criticizes such unequal distribution of wealth or such access to vast resources of wealth or the resources by only a small section of the society, and imposing the effects of those exploitation on those groups who are marginalized, who are weaker in the society. Now, there is a commonly held belief that the democracy better promotes the protection of environment than undemocratic countries. Obviously, when we are talking about the notion of the ecological democracy, then naturally we are assuming that the democracy is better suited to bring about the goals of environmental protection and preservation in comparison to the undemocratic countries. But here I would like to add that the researchers have pointed out that democracy need not be always able to suppress the environmental degradation. So, naturally when we are talking about democracy in the conventional or in the traditional sense of the term, then naturally we will be little bit pessimist or we will be little bit distraught, because we will find that even in some of the most developed countries which are having democracy and a very robust democracy, there we find the exploitation of resources are taking place at a rampant scale. For example, in the liberal democratic countries, the capitalist model of development which is prevalent have found to be promoting unequal distribution of environmental goods, lack of participatory decision making, and high levels of environmental degradation. Now, these three developments are interlinked with each other and they are very annoying, and it actually raises question about the efficacy of democracy in bringing about environmental protection, though we are talking about ecological democracy. But mind it, here we have to understand what type of democracy, because if we want to achieve a particular notion of democracy, then we have to adopt certain values and principles which we will study after some time. So, here let us concentrate on those features of the liberal democracy which raises question about the efficacy of democracy in bringing about the preservation of environment. And we find that the outcome is very sad, because we find that it has led to unequal distribution of goods, because we find that with the rise of the modern capitalist economy, with its more advancement, the distance between the rich and the poor, it is increasing and the gap is increasing, and the control over the wealth is also getting more and more, it is getting localized to a small section of elite in the society. Then lack of participatory decision making. Obviously, in an undemocratic setup, we cannot expect the people to participate in the decision making, and the obvious outcome of all these two processes is the tremendous hike in environmental degradation. Further, environmental decision making is dominated by expert scientists, where ordinary persons and their opinions are not taken into account by justifying that environmental issues are complex and they need expertise solution. Now, this is another very important and also it is an objectionable aspect of the modern notion of development, which has created a binary between the experts or the non-experts, the specialist and the non-specialist. And the non-specialist or the non-experts, they have no knowledge of science. It is believed that they do not possess the knowledge of science, therefore they are ignorant, they are illiterate, and most of the common people, especially those who are staying in the rural areas, are considered as illiterate because they do not possess the formal knowledge of science. Now, this creation of artificial binaries had led to the concentration of decision making only in the hands of those experts who are the knowers and the doers of science. It has led to concentration of decision making in the hands of certain privileged and elite section of the society. Whereas, if you see the level of knowledge about the environment or ecosystem possessed by the local people who are considered to be so called illiterate, it is immense and unimaginable. But unfortunately, they are not considered and they are not invited for their opinion or to participate in the decision making simply because they have no knowledge of science. So, this hierarchical supremacy of science over other forms of knowledge or the other sources of knowledge is another very objectionable aspect which has been pointed by the scholars of the ecological democracy. And further, it is said that the environmental issues are very complex and therefore it is beyond the level of comprehension by the ordinary people, and hence it is essential that those matters should be dealt with only by the experts and the scientists. Now, further we find that the global inequalities have also rendered the democratic decision making in matters related to environment very difficult. So, it is not only at the level of nation or at the level of state, but we also find at the global level that because of this tremendous inequality in terms of access to wealth or in terms of access to power and knowledge, we find that at the global level also there is absence of the participatory decision making. Now, North dominates the global environmental discourse, which Vandana Shiva has termed this green imperialism. Now, we have heard of so many types of imperialism and colonialism in the past, but this is a new form of imperialism which is green imperialism, which means that the domination of certain countries or group of people over the nature, over the extraction of resources for fulfilling their own ends at the cost of neglecting the needs and requirements of the vast section of the population, whether in a particular country or whether across the world. And this has been aided by the environmental discourse which has been dominated mostly by the North or the countries who belong to the Europe. So, therefore, it has led to not only neglect of the discourses or alternative discourses from the South, but it has also led to a type of exploitation and domination in the empirical sphere also. Now, in terms of sustainability goals, we find that the viewpoints of North and Southern countries are very divergent. And the reason, and one of the important reason behind, is the level of development between the northern countries and the southern countries. Because the northern countries, they are very developed, far more developed in terms of many aspects of life in comparison to the countries of the south. And this difference in the level of development has ramifications at multiple areas of life. Now, when we are talking about ecological protection, that means we have to put certain restrictions on the level of development, which the countries of the south are not ready to accept. And we will see that how countries of the north are pressurizing the countries of the south to adopt measures for environmental protection, whereas the third world countries have expressed that the sustainable goals are their prime necessity because it is required for maintaining their living standards, and therefore they cannot adopt stringent environmental measures. So, you can see that the priorities of the northern countries, because northern countries have already achieved a certain level of development. They are already at a very higher level of development, enjoying all the amenities of life. After achieving that level, now they are having the privilege to talk about environmental protection, and they are asking the countries of the south or the developing countries to adopt certain restrictions on their level of development, which the countries of the south are not ready to accept, because they are saying that when it is the time to make their own development, then the countries of the north are putting lots of restriction, which is a violation of their right to development. So, therefore, we can find that on the question of environmental protection, on the question of how to achieve the sustainable goals, there is somewhat a tension between the countries of the north and the countries of the south. Now, they refuse to accept restrictions on their right to development, which I have already explained. Now, various emerging environmental crises have helped in mobilizing policy makers at the state and international levels, as well as local communities, for environmental injustices. Now, this is an emerging phenomena which we are witnessing in the recent years, that because of the various environmental crises which are erupting across various corners of the world at different points of time, have helped in mobilizing those people who are affected to come out to protest, and they have pleaded for making changes in the governmental policy, or environmental activism has grown because of the rise in environmental injustices and environmental degradation. It has also helped in building new modes of democratic participatory mechanism. So, obviously, with the rise of activism, more and more people are getting aware, and they are participating, they are advocating for their rights, and they are actually trying to influence the government in bringing about changes. So, somehow indirectly or directly, they are involving at some levels of environmental decision making. Now, ecological democracy is relevant in the present times when the world is facing rising population along with manifold environmental crises and depletion of natural resources. So, again I would like to repeat that in the present world, in the contemporary world, the talk about ecological democracy is very, very relevant. It is very contemporaneous, because we are already on the risk of extinction. It is a question of our survival. If we do not take immediate measures to stop this environmental degradation further, then there will be point of no return. It will be a threat to our existence. It will be an existential crisis. So, now in the present time, the talk about ecological democracy, I think it is very, very important and significant. Now, ecological democracy has strong chances of success in countries which have strong roots of participatory action at the local level. Obviously, a country which is having a long culture and historical background of democratic functioning, of involvement of people at the local level in the decision making, or the role of the people in the decision making which are related to environment, there we find that there is more chances of ecological democracy to take its root. Now, especially in the context of India, we can find the existence of such participatory modes of decision making, which has witnessed participation by local people over environmental concern. And I would like to quote two important movements which have taken place in the recent years, and which are actually quoted across the world as a very good example of the participation of people in environmental decision making. The first is the Chipko movement, and second is the Narmada Bachao Andolan. Now, Chipko movement was a non-violent form of protest. It is termed as the environmentalism of the poor. In our subsequent slides and lecture, we will see in much more detail about the Chipko movement, but here it is enough to understand that it was not a violent protest, because the people, they do not have any arms and they do not have any ammunitions. They are very ordinary and common people, and especially women, who played a very important role in Chipko movement when they prevented the timber merchants to cut the trees in the Uttaranchal area by hugging the trees. So, it is a tremendous sign of activism by common people and especially women in a very, very non-violent manner. Hence, it is termed as environmentalism of the poor, or environmental activism of the poor and the marginalized. Now, ecological democracy have raised doubts about the techno-scientific approach to environmental issues. So there is no doubt that the excessive use of science and technology have led to the depletion of our environmental diversity. It is advocated for an expansive approach that integrates scientific approaches with the citizens' participation in environmental decision making. So, it is not saying that you completely do away with the scientific approach, you do not use science and technology. It is talking of using science and technology, but within a limit. With the involvement of people in the scientific decision making or in the environmental decision making, we can set a limit to which we can use science and technology, or in other words, there should not be indiscriminate use of science and technology for development. Now, there are two important elements of ecological democracy. One is the ecological sustainability and second is human equity. The term ecological sustainability is the maintenance and preservation of ecosystem, as the name suggests, and it is all functions on which all life depends. It also includes maintenance of biodiversity. So, in other words, it aims at maintaining the ecosystem, or it talks about preservation of the biodiversity and to ensure that all lives which are dependent on this ecosystem is preserved and protected. So, it is talking about sustaining the ecosystem and maintaining its level as it was. Human equity means equal access to resources, equal opportunities, access to decision making and protection of cultural rights. So, it includes a set of rights, you can say a canvas of rights which talks about freedom, equality, access to equal opportunity, access to decision making and so on. So, if these parameters are satisfied, then we can say that a certain level of human equity is in existence. So, human equity and the ecological sustainability are two important elements of ecological democracy. Ecological democracy encourages continuous and mutually the respectful dialogue between human beings and also between human beings and nature. Some of the important proponents of ecological democracy are R. Morrison, Ross A. Michel, Daniel Ungaro, William A. Shutkin, Vandana Shiva, Michel Masson, Andrew Dobson, etc. And I would like to quote a very important theorist, John S. Dryzek, who in his book titled Rational Ecology, Environment and Political Economy describes various means by which the collective decision making can be achieved on ecology. The means are very important because they have far reaching ramifications for the type of society in which we will live. So, you can see that Dryzek is maintaining, or he is emphasizing upon building a connection between the means which we are using for collective decision making and finally the type of society we want to build, and there is an intimate connection between the two. Further, he talks about ecological rationality that will guide collective decision making based on notions of justice, individual liberty, economic efficiency, freedom and of course environmental concern. So, at the end of this slide, I would like to again emphasize upon the point that there has to be continuous and mutually a dialogue which is based on respect, which is based on a sense of responsibility, not only between human beings, but also between human beings and other species in this world. And we have to understand that if we are talking about ecological democracy, then we have to understand that we have to reimagine the notion of democracy from a new perspective. We have also to talk about changing the values which have constituted the basis or foundation of the traditional notion of democracy, because the traditional notion of democracy, we know that it emphasizes more on elections, on winning votes, on formation of government. It means political parties, it means making decisions. But you know that the meaning of democracy is much more broader, and especially that aspect of democracy I think most important, which is more important even than right to vote or right to contest election, and that is right of the citizens to participate in the decision making. Whether the citizens' voices are getting heard by the government in everyday decision making, or in other words, whether the ordinary citizens are able to exercise influence or able to make changes and transformation in the policies and decisions of their government by their own strength. These are some of the fundamental parameters which can help us in understanding whether a democracy is truly functioning in the real sense of the term, or it is only a pseudo democracy which has been limited only to exercising right to vote, winning election and forming government. And moreover, besides some of the foundational weaknesses which we have witnessed in the functioning of democracy, when we are using the word ecological democracy, then we have to be more particular about reinterpreting the notion of democracy, because we have already seen that the traditional notion of democracy, which is based on the liberal ideals and especially the liberal notion of democracy, which is based on certain values which are not at all conducive for the protection and preservation of environment, whether it is a value of competitiveness, whether it is the question of the commodification, whether it is the issue of dominance, or whether it is a market relation, or whether it is the individualism, or in other words the possessive individualism or the acquisitive tendencies, they all work against the very notion of environmental protection. On the contrary, we need a set of values, we need a set of norms, and these values are already present in our ancient Indian culture. If you go back to our ancient Indian culture, in our ancient texts and scriptures, we find that all these norms and values of environmental protection are very clearly mentioned, and it has been practiced by people over the ages. But unfortunately, with the coming of the Western modern of development, we have completely forgotten all those values, and we have blindly copied the Western model of development without understanding, without analyzing the repercussions which will have on our own country, on our own social and economic system. So therefore, when we talk about development, when we are talking about human progress, because our humanity has progressed a lot, but we have to analyze that progress has been really equitable or not, who has benefited from the progress, and who are those sections of the society who is enjoying all the privileges and fruits of development, on what cost it has been achieved, and especially the cost of environmental degradation. All these questions needs to be answered, whether it is a question of justice or individual liberty or environmental concern. Then only we can say whether our democracy has failed or it has actually succeeded, or whether we need a new model of democracy. So at the end of this lecture, I have given a couple of questions which are based on the concepts which we have covered. And the first is, what is ecological democracy? Why sustainability is an important element of ecological democracy? Why there is difference between North and South over ecological protection measures? Why participation and dialogue are important elements of ecological democracy? And at the end of this lecture, I have given a couple of questions so that it can steer your imagination and you think and answer these questions, like why present notion of democracy is unable to prevent the ecological devastation. In spite of so many pressing environmental concerns, why they do not form part of mainstream political discourse. I think this is a very fundamental problem, because no political parties is talking about the environmental concerns in their election manifesto. So why it is not happening? Now I leave it to you to think about it. Think of the two ways in which the citizens can participate in ecological decision making. So with these words, I come to the end of this lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it, and thank you very much.